Hello, I'm Daniel from CG Dreams. This video tutorial is the first part of multiple videos to come on the topic of rigging. This video is a primer for a total new user to Cinema 4D who wants to get into rigging aspects of this software, or for those who wish to get an introduction to Cinema 4D rigging toolset and features. If you're already familiar with what the basic concepts of rigging is, and you already know Cinema 4D well enough to create a basic rig, then this video may not be for you. But please do watch along if you still want to see what it's about and get a recap on things. Rigging is the process of adding joints to a seemingly static 3D object so that that object can be animated. This would include not only making it move from one position to another, but have many intricate details of a model, such as this one here, to be fully animatable, to come to life and to move on to a stage from something that's static to something that's fully animated and moving. The process of rigging would be by adding joints to your character in a particular location along the chain of your limbs. As an example, in this particular case it would be multiple joints created for all of the legs, the wings, the antennae, the thorax, the abdomen, and so on. Rigging is quite a complex process as it gets further on, and it's for this reason that there's some do's and don'ts when it comes to rigging. And to sum it up, you really need to be very organized when you're doing the rigging process. All the rigging tools in Cinema 4D can be found up here in the character menu. From here we have all of the tools necessary to completely add a rig to your character. There are some other tools elsewhere which we will use in conjunction with these rigging tools, but these are the actual rigging tools. What I tend to do is I tend to undock this and place this at a location so that I can constantly get access to this. You can also go and use the layout that comes with Cinema 4D R25 by going to the top right where it says New Layouts, and check this so it's like off position, and then you've got a rigging layout there. Here you'll find that you've got all of the tools that you need to access. Clicking back, going back to the standard page again. If you don't like where these tools are, as I said, you can undock them quite easy, and you can easily dock them in another place or location inside your user interface. This is exactly what I've done. I've made my own pipeline set of tools by customizing the layout, and I've added the ones that I commonly use here when I'm doing rigging. For the sake of purpose of being consistent with what you're viewing on your screen, I'm going to be working with the standard layout that comes with R25, and I'll simply just undock the menus so that you'll be able to follow along more closer to what I'm doing. A single joint is not a bone. You need two joints to make a bone. As you can see here, I've got one joint added to the scene, and yet we see no bone. In order for there to be a bone, there needs to be a beginning and an end point of the joint to make up a bone. For this reason, we need at least two joints to make up a bone. If I was to copy this joint and put it inside the other, so one becomes a child of the parent, and then move the last joint in the chain, you can see now we've actually got a bone. This is because we've now got the joints beginning and end, a parent and child. There are various ways to add joints and bones, and in all cases we go to the character menu to access these. The first way is to use the joint tool. we hold down the control key and we click in the user interface, and you can see here that we can create joints according to where we click with the left mouse button. As we add each joint, you can see that a hierarchy of joints are built up in a parent to child relationship, so that all joints are all linked to the previous joint to itself, other than the actual root joint itself. Another way you can add a joint is by going to the same menu again and clicking on the joint where you just create one single joint. You can see that it's created this. Often it's the case that you want to use this tool when you want to add a joint in between as a child or a parent to a joint that already exists. As an example, if I select joint number 2, hold down the shift key when I'm clicking on this, you can see here that this joint has been made a child to the joint that I had selected. Alternatively, if you hold down the Alt key when creating this joint, it puts this joint as the parent to the joint that you've already selected. This is a good way to add joints as a parent or as a child in the middle of your chain of joints if you felt that you didn't have enough joints there. Another way to add joints, particularly if it's a limb or something like a tubular type of shape, is to make them from a selection of edges. So in this particular case, I'm going to make a selection of edges from the top, the middle and the bottom, and then I'm going to make it convert this selection to joints, and this way it's going to create the joints exactly in line with these edges and through the center of the geometry. So to do this, we go back to the character menu, and you can see we've got this convert command here. If you hold down the shift key and click selection to joints, you'll notice that you've now got 3 joints. Once the joints are created, you would need to organize the hierarchy to be in the correct order. So for instance, joint number 0 is the first joint, and then we've got the second joint, and then we've got the third joint. You'll notice here that when we create it like this, that it's created the joints exactly where you created them inside the selection of the geometry. You can also convert nulls to joints. Nulls are like placeholders or like folders in which other children can go into them to keep things organized. So in this particular case, if I select all of these nulls with the middle mouse button, go to the character menu, and we've got convert to joints, you'll see here that we've actually got the joints with exactly the same name as the null created in exactly the same location. There can be times where you've got a null in place of where there should be a joint, and this would be the ideal situation where you may want to convert that null back to a joint of what it should be. You can also create a spline and use that spline to make joints from. This is very handy in cases where you've actually already got a spline made, or you want to use an IK spline. This is something that we look into later on, but for now just see that this spline here, if we go to the character menu, go to convert, and you can see here that we've got this spline to joints option, and then it's made all of these joints along the spline. IK and FK is terminology that you're likely to hear quite a lot in the rigging community, and this is because these are 2 standards in which enable you to animate your character's joints. IK is inverse kinematics, and it works in a way that a chain is created between the beginning of an object down to an endpoint of an object. And when we select the goal of that IK chain, it enables us to move this goal, and the rest of the limbs are going to be operating like a real leg would work. In other words, if you used to lift up someone's ankle, you would find that the shin and the knee and the thigh would bend in the likewise manner. So this is like an automated way to move the entire leg by moving just one single controller. This is called the IK goal controller. FK, on the other hand, forward kinematics, is exactly what you would possibly imagine it to be, and that is basically a more manual way of orientating or rotating your joints. So as an example here, if I select this joint and I go to the rotation tool, I'm going to be able to rotate this joint here at the knee. Same for the ankle, and even straight for the top of the thigh. This is what's called forward kinematics, and this enables you to do more of a manual approach to get the joints in a particular position. They've both got their pros and cons, and times when you would use either of them, but in either case you're going to be making quite a lot of IK chains in the rig that I'm going to be going through as a more in-depth tutorial series, rigging a bumblebee. Constraints is something that you're going to be very familiar with once you start to rig, and constraints are ways to allow the control of another object affect another. It also gives you some additional control that you wouldn't normally have if you didn't use constraints. As an example here, we've got this spline shape. Now if I was to move this spline shape, you can clearly see that it moves of its own accord. However, if I wanted the spline to move the entire leg rig that I've got here, albeit a basic one, I would then assign what's called a parent constraint. And essentially what we do is we are telling a leg joint, in this particular case, to give the control over to the root controller. This is what I've called it, the root controller. So typically the way to do this would be to select what joint or null that you want to give control over to something else first, and then you hold down the control key and then select the root controller secondary. It's really important that you do it in that order, or the order that you want the control to be handed over. We're giving the leg to give control over to the root controller. Once we select them two, we can go to the character menu, and in here we've got constraints. And you can see here there's actually quite a few different types of constraints, but for now we're just going to go with the most common and basic one, which is the parent constraint. So we're going to select this, and you'll notice that nothing really has seemed to have happened. However, you can see that this constraint tag has now been added to the leg, and inside this, when we've got this selected in the attributes, we've got the information about what type of constraint's been added, and in this second tab we've got the setup that's automatically been created for us. Some basic things about here is that we can tell it to be controlling the position, the rotation and the scale. So we've got control over what we are handing over the control over to. In this particular case, this is given the entire control over to the root controller. This means that now we can grab that root controller and move it, and you can see here that the leg's moving along with it. Now you can obviously see that this IK goal here is not moving along, and this is because this is a separate controller away from the leg. You can see here that this is an IK controller. What we typically do in this particular case is we make sure that the controller is always under the main master or root controller, so that when we select this now and we move the root controller, everything comes along for the ride. This is kind of a good introductory to a hierarchy, the chain of events and how things are tied together, because if you don't have the hierarchical order put in place, then your rig will not function. And you'll find as you go through, you need to pay particular care and attention to what is a child to a parent and what that parent is a child to. You're going to be making a quite in-depth hierarchical process of joints and controllers as you go through the rigging process. and this governs what is controlling what moves what. And in the case of constraints, it's more of a visible handover of control than a child being placed into a controller. This constraint is an invisible way of handing over control to something else. This means that we can hide away our joints and now use the controllers as the main means to do our animation. And it is the case that we will be creating controllers that will become the new controller for the joints. In other words, we select the controllers to do the animation rather than directly selecting the joints. Because typically when we've got a character rigged, you would have the joints hidden away, and the only thing you should be seeing is the controllers that operate those joints. Now, I've already touched on controllers a little bit, but I'm going to go into it a little bit more depth now. We've got two legs. We've got an IK and an FK. So you can see here with the IK that we've got a controller, and this controller is our IK control, and it's by default created when you create this IK chain. You can see there. Now, the problem with this controller that it's created is that while you can select it and then choose the shape that you want and even the size of that shape, what you can't do with this controller is change its shape manually or reorientate where the actual controller is. In other words, the controller is always going to be placed central to the pivot point of that joint whenever it is a null type controller. For this reason, these null controllers are often not used as controllers, but they're just simply as a starting point for your IK control. Now, moving over to the FK leg here, you can see here that I've created these spline controls, and they are indeed located exactly where they need to be in the pivot point and orientation of the joint. This is really, really important that it's placed exactly where the joint's pivot point is and its orientation, so that when we rotate the controller, when it's been assigned via the parent constraint, it's going to be orientated correctly. Now, at the moment, if I was to select this leg directly, this joint directly, you can see move it. But we're going to assume that when we finish this rig that we don't no longer want to be selecting the joints directly. So what we do is we start to assign the parent constraints. So for instance, we've got this leg. We want to assign this leg number 1, which is going to be the phi. Let's call this phi. We're going to then select the phi controller, go to our character menu and constraints, and then we're going to just tear this off because we're going to use it a few times. We're going to add a parent constraint. We could do the same thing. This is for the shin. Select the shin. This will be to our knee. Again, you've got to select it in the correct order. And we're going to select a parent constraint. And then we're going to go to the next one down. This is our ankle. Select the ankle first, and then the ankle controller, parent constraint, and then last we got the toes. So the toes to the toe, and add a parent constraint. The last joint is always going to be the tip. So in this particular case, it'd be toe tip. And this is not something that has any real influence over anything. We just need that joint to be there in order to form a bone. Now we've done this constraint setup, we can now close the rig so that we no longer need to see it anymore as far as the joints are concerned. However, we do need some kind of hierarchy in place here so that when we move the thigh, the knee moves. When we move the knee, the ankle moves, and when we move the ankle, the toe moves. So we have to create a same hierarchical setup as we've got here within the controllers. So as an example here, the thigh is the top upmost controller, so we put the knee as a child to the thigh, the ankle as a child to the knee, and the toe a child to the ankle. And that's all we need to do. Now we've got a controller set up for this leg. If we select the thigh, we can now rotate it from the controller rather than directly at the bone. We select the knee, we can do the same for the knee. We select the ankle, and you guessed it, we can rotate from the ankle, and then the toe, we can rotate at the toe. What we would typically do when we are creating these as we go along, and I will mention this quite a few times later on, is we would do what's called a freeze transforms. This is found in the coordinates menu, and if you click on freeze all, what it will do is it will freeze this position as the default location position, so that if you need to reset your joint back to where it was before, you can simply just reset it. As an example here, if I was to rotate the knee and I wish to reset it, then all I have to do is I just go back to the coordinates, and this is a little tab that opens up here, and we click on reset transform, and the knee will pop back into position. This is a good way to reset your posed character back to default again. Now in the case of this IK, we've already got a controller, but as I mentioned here, the controller is not really located ideally as a controller. So what we can do in this particular case is we can assign that to a new controller. This is the circle we're going to call the foot. Now there's two ways we can do this. We can drag and drop the IK goal as a child to the foot controller, as you can see there. And now when we move the foot controller, we kind of get this kind of setup, which isn't really what we want. Or what we can do is we can create a IK constraint. They both do the same thing. So there's no reason why you can't drag and drop this one into there in this particular case, because it's not really the same as doing the same with the joints, because the joints is something that you really want to keep out of the way when you finished your rig. Now the difference between a controller that's made out of a spline as to a null is that with the null you can't move the object that you see without moving its pivot point, whereas the spline controller you can. Now at the moment you can see the spline controller is actually right in the center, right under its feet. I can move this wherever I want, doesn't matter. But I do need its pivot point to be located right at the point of where this ankle is. So we can do that with great ease. What we can do is we can go and select the axis tool, so you can see that. Turn that on for our spline, and we can select the snapping, and I want to go to this option here, and when I want to choose axis snapping, and now when I move this up towards there, it's going to click and snap into place of where the ankle is. Now this is one of a couple of ways that this can be done. I'm just showing you this just for the speed of it, okay? So it's locked into position, and assuming that's locked into position exactly the way it needs to be, and it doesn't always snap in the first time, we can take off this axis tool, and now when we drag and drop the null goal into there, we can now select this controller, and now it will rotate correctly. Now obviously we haven't assigned anything at the moment there, so this is why there's no assignment to this controller as it stands. The assignment I'm talking about is the parent constraint. So let's go to this. We look at this quickly there, and we make sure that the goal is set correctly, and it is. And now I'm going to move this, and now you see we no longer have to select this anymore. In fact, we can actually go to the object and make it invisible, because now we can select our controller, which is always going to be seen under the foot, and that controller is always going to select that for the correct location. And this works for both rotation and translation, even scale. the controller can take over all three of those for an object. And this is how we can use controllers in our scene. The way that we tend to work with controllers is that if you're going to visibly see the controller and you have to select it in your viewport, then we use spline controls. If we're going to be adding some kind of controller that you don't need to see, then it can be a null-based controller. Now remember, the null-based controllers can be placed inside or assigned to by a parent constraint to a IK spline controller. It's just the IK spline controllers give you more control as to the actual visible shape's location to be away from its own pivot point. I've created this rather basic leg to show you what binding is. And binding, simply put, is the way to bind your geometry, your 3D model, to the joints, so that when the joints move, then so does the leg move along with it, or wherever it is that you've actually done the rigging for. The way in which this works is on a vertex basis. Each point on your model is assigned a certain amount of weight to the joint that is closest to. So in other words, you can see this phi here. This phi has got a multitude of vertices, and let's just select a couple here. And each of these vertices, when bound to this particular phi joint, is going to be assigned a certain strength of influence, so that the influence of the joint can then start to move these vertices along with it. Now the influence is going to be changing according to where it is on the joint and what type of joint that it's going to be for. In other words, if you've got a joint that's been placed inside an object that moves as a whole, then you'd have 100% of the influence assigned to that joint for all of the vertices. But when it comes to something that deforms, like something organic, such as a leg, it means that you've got to have some points not be given 100% to a particular joint, but be sharing its influence between more than one joint, so that it deforms correctly. So when we do the binding process, essentially it is weighting or giving a certain amount of influence to the joint as to what vertices are going to do when that joint moves. Now luckily there is auto weighting and there's manual weighting, a way of doing things, but I'm going to show you the automatic way first. So the way in which we do this is we select our leg, which started off as a cylinder, and then we select also with the shift key held down all of our joints. Now if you hold down the middle mouse button when you select the first root joint and click on this with the shift key, it selects all of the hierarchy of joints, all the children. And this is what you would have to do the automatic binding process. So with these both selected, I could then go to the character menu, and you can see here we've got this bind. If we click on this, it's done, and it seems like nothing has actually happened, but in fact it actually has. If you go to the object manager, what you will see is you will see this weighting tag has been applied to the leg. And when you select this weighting tag and go to the attributes of the tag, you can see here that it's assigned the joints that we selected when we done the binding process. Now when we were to select one of these controllers that we've already assigned and rotate, you'll see now that the geometry, the actual 3D model, is now animating. It's now moving along with the rotation of the joints. Now if we wanted to see how much influence is on the joints, we can open up the weight manager, holding down the shift key and double clicking on the weight tag, and this opens up the weighting manager, which gives you all sorts of control over the weighting process, which we won't go into now. But what I do want you to look at is you can see this color gradient that's going from the thigh down to the shin, down to the foot, and then down to the toes. We've got the like an orange tone going into yellow, into green, and into the blue. And you can see here that it's transitioning. It's got a gradient between one colour and another, and this is this gradient which is showing you the influence is transitioning between one joint and another as to its weighting. And this is what gives us this bending motion at the knees, the bending motion at the ankle and at the toes that looks more natural and organic. And that's all I'm going to cover as far as binding is concerned. Now there is a manual way of doing the binding, and the manual way, it does exactly the same with the process of this, other than you get to have more control, and that's normally the process with these things. If you want more control, you do things a bit more along the manual approach. Now there's one thing that I need to add to finish this off, is that even though we've got this weighting tag on the leg, you can also see that there's something as a child to the geometry. If we expand this, you can see here that a skin tag is being added. Now this is a deformer that works along with the weighting tag in order to store this information in the weighting tag and be placed between the bone and the geometry. So this is like a partnership. They both work together. You always have to have a skin deformer along with working with the weight expression or the weight tag. You've got the both, then you are good to go to start to do the weighting process. Now we've done the weighting process in a automatic way, but you've actually got other ways to actually do the weighting with a brush found in the character menu, and this is the weight tool. And then when you've got the weight tool, you can actually paint on the influence of a particular joint, and you can right click, select a joint, and it will select that joint. And then you can use some of these options in here, like an absolute weighting. It's going to add absolute amount of influence in the particular area at 100%. We can choose all of these other tools within the weighting, such as bleeding, smoothing. As an example here, we can choose to just smooth this out a little bit more around the knee area, and this will actually have the effect of making it a little bit more better transition. And it's the case that when your automatic weighting doesn't really do the job that you want it to do, that you would then go to the manual weighting side of things to clear things up. So for instance, you can go in here and start to do some smoothing in here, and it will start to affect the way that our weighting is actually going to be working. So that's just a very, very basic introduction to weighting. But as far as binding is concerned, the binding is the process to bind our geometry to the joints, so that the joints then have control over its movement, rotation and scale, and then we can start to do the animation. Finally, I'm going to leave you with some thought on workflow. And the first thing that I want to bring up for workflow is always create a project folder and create subsequent subfolders within that project folder, so you can keep everything in its correct place. It really is important to keep organized. So as an example here, I've got a folder called Spider, and inside this Spider I've got meshes. Inside meshes I've got Alembic, Cinema 4D, FBX, OBJ, in which I can place my different parts into there as and when I need to when I'm creating a project. You can also see I've got reference images, and inside here there may be even more subfolders. So this reference images would be for something that I'm modeling. And then again, rigging. This is anything to do with the rigging process that I may be doing. So what I'm saying is really think about the project and don't become lazy and just dump in something somewhere. When you're creating files, give them some meaningful name. Call them version 1, version 2, version 3 as you go along. Just really keep organized, so that when the project gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you're able to then see all these files in the correct places, and you know where to find things later on. This brings me on to the second point, is you always want to name things. Name absolutely everything. Don't go for the process of creating loads of joints and not naming them. Also, when it comes to naming, is you want to make sure that you add the prefix or the postfix. The prefix is at the beginning of the name of your joint. As an example, it would be maybe a left leg or a right leg. So often you would use an L, capital L underscore, and that would be indicating that this is a left limb. Or if it was a postfix, it would be the end of the name of whatever it is that you're naming, and it would be the same thing. It would be, say, underscore L underscore R for right. It's important that you keep a real consistency with this, so you don't change your mind halfway through the rigging and say, oh, I'll start using postfix, oh, I'm going to start using prefix, oh, I'm going to start using lowercase, uppercase. It really does matter, because as your project grows, you're going to have hundreds of joints, tons and tons of controllers, hierarchies of nulls, and you need to know where everything is. And you need to know where you can quickly find the difference between the left side of a character and the right side. And when it comes to using the search features inside the object manager, that's when it's going to come into its own. You're going to be able to search in here, and you're going to be using this a lot, believe me. The left side, the right side, a particular limb, say thighs, the left thigh. Make sure that you use the correct naming and terminology. It's good to understand the terminology if you're working on a character, an animal, a creature, and name the joints to what they should be, or at least something that you can recognize. Thigh, shin, foot, toe, collarbone, shoulder, bicep, forearm, wrist. You get the idea. Just make sure that you use the proper name conventions all the way through. Another thing to say is that you don't want to bind your character too early to the joints or the rig. It can be tempting to do this, but you don't want to do it. Try to work on the rig solely and work on getting it functioning really, really well before you start to do any binding tests, because that can distract you and it can pull you away from what you're doing. Also, when it comes to the rigging process, is don't be tempted to mirror copy the limbs from, say, the left side to the right side too early. You want to make sure that the limbs are fully functional and finished. In other words, you're going to have all the FK controllers in place, all the IK controllers in place. You're going to have everything functioning and working exactly the way you need it to function before you start to do any mirroring. This is because when you do the mirroring from one side of the body to the other, you want to mirror all of those things. Everything. You want to mirror the whole lot. The controllers, the post-morphs, the weighting even. Everything to do with the way things are set up. All the constraints. They take time. They take a lot of time to do. So make sure that you just do one limb at a time on one side of the body, get it fully working, and then mirror it over afterwards. Another thing to add here is freezing transforms. Freezing transforms is when you've made a set of controllers like this, and when you initially create them, you'll find that your controllers will actually be in the position, hopefully, that you want them to be in, so that when you do your animating, it's going to be always in the correct location. Now, because the controllers are going to be signed as the main controller to take over the rotation and the translation of your joints, it's really important that when you assign these controllers, that you're able to get back to this initial state again, this initial position, the default position of your rig. And the best way to do that is to select all of your controllers, or as you go, once you've got them in place, and then you want to go to your coordinates, and then go to freeze transformations, and then freeze all. When you do this, what it's going to do is it's going to freeze all these transformations, so that when it comes to resetting your character back to its default pose again, all you have to do is then select these controllers and then reset it. So as an example here, if I bend the knee out like that and I want to reset it to its default, I can just click on this reset transform, and then he goes back to exactly the way it was. And you can imagine if you're going to be posing your character to some larger degree, you've made quite a few adjustments. You want to be able to select all your controllers and then reset them so that it goes back to its original position and place for all your controllers. Saved often. You want to save often and save different variation versions of your project. Don't overwrite your same project file. You may get a crash. You may get some errors that you hadn't noticed that you saved. And then you can go back to a slightly older version of your project and pick up from there. I hope you enjoyed the primer video into the rigging for Cinema 4D. It should give you an idea that Cinema 4D is rather intuitive, relatively easy to learn, and with a bit of patience and time and hard work, you can get some really nice results from its rigging process and animation. So what's next? Well, what next is we're going to be going through the entire process of how to make this rig for the bee. Now the bee in this particular iteration, I would say, has had some changes from the video that I made how to create a bee, but the rigging process is exactly the same. So even though I've updated this bee to be a little bit more anatomically correct, it won't make any difference to the rigging process. I will be showing you how to rig the bee and have all of this control over your bee character. We're going to be covering everything from scratch, and we're going to be going through it in a way in which is hopefully going to be giving you a little bit of insight into how to create your own rig and apply it to other characters. If you like this video and you like future videos and you've looked at some of my previous videos, all I ask you is to please subscribe, click that like button and leave a comment if you wish. I really do need this extra support so I can support you and to continue to provide videos for you. If I don't get these likes and these subscriptions, then my videos goes into the background of YouTube and they don't get seen by others, and that's a great shame because of the amount of time and work and effort that I put into these videos. So please do go ahead, it doesn't take long, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button and leave a comment.